Can I ask everyone to please find a seat? Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Jack Templeton Liberty Series. This is a last program of our 2023 fiscal year. We've had over 24 lectures. They've all been really wonderful and well attended. And I thank all of you who support all the work we do, in particular these lecture programs. I want to thank especially Jefferson Health. Jefferson Health is our lead sponsor for all of our lecture programs. And I want to thank Rich Haversteck and Ed Trzanski for making this happen. My sincere appreciation for all that you do for these great programs. And to all of you who support the work of the Legacy Foundation. We need more. We need more of you, and we need more from you to do the great work that we do, whether it's our civics education programs, our scholarship programs, the care of this great collection and this great historic house, and I thank you for your support. So tonight's program will be about an hour long, as they always are. We will have a Q&A at the end. I will ask you now if you would silence your cell phones, please. The Q&A, of course, we are streaming live, so please use the microphones. I will moderate the Q&A, and staff will come down and hand you the microphones, but please use those microphones. So tonight is the last of our programs. We have wonderful programs coming up. They are all listed in your program, but I will point out that they are not here, most of them. Most of them are in our amenity properties, whether it's Liberty Hill, Torresdale, or UL National. So while we are still here and we'll do some things here, we'll have quite a number of lectures at those other properties over the next couple of weeks. What we do is made possible really through the leadership, volunteer leadership of our members and others who support the mission of the Legacy Foundation. And now to introduce tonight's program is the leader of all the leaders, my boss, Mr. Jim Dunnigan. Jim.
Thank you. That's the first I've heard described like that, but good evening, everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Mr. Rich Lowry. Mr. Lowry is the editor-in-chief of the National Review. He writes for the Politico and often appears on such public affairs programs as Meet the Press. He is a regular panelist on the KCRW program Left, Right, and Center. He is the author of Lincoln Unbound, The Case for Nationalism, How It Made Us Powerful, United and Free, and Legacy, Paying the Price for the Clinton Years, a New York Times bestseller. Mr. Lowry began his career as a research analyst for Charles Krauthammer, and in 1997, he was selected by William F. Buckley to lead National Review. So please welcome back to the Legacy Foundation, Mr. Rich Lowry.
Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. Just one thing I want to note, and this will involve some of the themes of my discussion tonight, but if you're in my line of work, one thing you want people to do, especially politicians, is use the correct and truthful words for things. This is just a key element in the battle for the future of the country and for truth, the proper use of words and not letting people resort to euphemism. But this is a lost cause that I've come to realize. It'll never happen, and it's been brought home to me as often fundamental truths are by your kids, and by my kids. So my oldest daughter, Julia, she learned, this is a little while ago now, but she learned the word stupid for the first time, and she was quite pleased with herself. She was saying this a lot. It's not the worst word a kid's ever going to learn, obviously, but it's kind of annoying to have a little toddler running around saying stupid, stupid all the time. So I took her aside and I was like, Julia, why not, don't say stupid all the time. Why don't you say ill-considered instead? And, I'm the editor of National Review. I got to try at least, right? So this had the effect that you would imagine. Zero, she stupid. And this is around the time she was getting potty trained, and my wife would put in a little pad in the back of her pants for extra protection. And one Saturday morning, she gets up and goes to the toilet and has a very successful trip. And I guess in an excess of zeal, she also takes this pad out, throws it in the toilet, flushes the whole thing. It all backs up. It's just a catastrophe in there. I mean, it's a sewage level disaster. My wife, who's always running after the kids, her last nerve is always being worked. And she's like, Rich, you got to clean that up and you got to talk to her. This just can't happen. When things like this happen, I'm always blamed. I'm not, maybe not rightly, I don't know. But anyway, so I go in there, I'm plunging, I'm swabbing, I'm plunging, I'm swabbing. It takes 20 minutes or something the whole time. Rich, you got to talk to her. All right, I'll talk to her. So I finally clean it up. I come out and I take Julia on my knee for what I hope is going to be really a really nice father-daughter moment. I say, Julia, what did you do wrong? You said, Daddy, I did something ill-considered. So it is a true pleasure to be in this place. I gave a talk a couple years ago now in another beautiful room. Every place in here is a beautiful room. It's just a marvelous club and a great pleasure to me. Mark Twain said the best audience is inquisitive, well-informed, and drunk. So the chances if the cocktail hour would go on a little longer, I think we could be 3 for 3 with a lot of people. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is the assault on writing and literature that's ongoing as we speak, how this relates to a broader assault on key elements of our culture, and how this plays into threats to our civilization. So it'll be a really uplifting discussion tonight. So let me start with the writing, obviously something I think a lot about. Writing, first thing to know about writing, it is hard. And I love these 2 quotes. And forgive me, I'm not naturally a PowerPoint guy, but I want to discuss some passages of writing tonight. Just the best way to do it is put it up on the screens. But Red Smith, great sports writer, mid-20th century, said writing is very easy. You just open up your vein and bleed, right? It's easy. And there's Kyle Smith, one of our former writers at National Review, who's now gone on to be the movie critic for the Wall Street Journal. No relation to Red Smith. He wrote this in his last piece for us about the things he'd written at National Review. And forgive me, it's a little long, but I really think it captures it. He wrote, someone pointed out that my profile, Beto O'Rourke, if anyone remembers him, was a lot of fun. And I had to disagree because I'd forgotten what I wrote. All I could remember was how I wrote it. The platoon-like jungle slog of inching ahead, sentence by agonizing sentence, partly at the St. Agnes Library in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and then as the evening deadline loomed, moving over to the Barnes & Noble on Broadway and 82nd Street so I could swill coffee as I wrote, each syllable like doing a squat thrust. Structuring a joke is about as much fun as structuring a tax shelter. Now that I've forgotten what was in the piece, though, I can read it over, the 3 minutes worth of words that are left after 9 hours of rubbing my forehead and staring into space, and amuse myself. As a reader, I'm completely in tune with the writer's sense of humor. First of all, that's great writing, right? And he rubbed his forehead for like 5 hours to get these 300 words. So that's the most basic point. It's hard, but it's easy to mess up. It is easy to mess up. So let's look at a famous passage and think about this a little bit. Easy is something we all know. Here he is. First sentence of the Gettysburg Address. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. We all know that, right? Let's edit it. Like a basic premise of editing, if you can make it shorter, you make it shorter. You can make it simpler. You make it simpler. If you can make it easier to understand, you make it easier to understand. So I'm an editor, right? I did it. 87 years ago, the founder started a new country on the basis of liberty and equality. Shorter, simpler. Everyone understands it, right? So why, and this is the audience participation portion of this evening, why, does anyone have any thoughts why the edited version is not as good? True, granted. Let's go a little deeper. Cadence is part of it, kind of the music, the poetry. What's that? Right. Yeah. Why? Let's go a little deeper. Any thoughts? What? Let's think about this. So, 7 years. No one talks like that, right? You don't. Talking to your kids about something happened years ago. You don't talk that way. Where does that come from? Do you think? Right? And it's biblical. Exactly. And look at this word, conceived. What's conceived mean? What's that? Born, yeah. So conceived, you can think of it, but if you just said think or believed in there, you miss the other meaning, birth. And the Gettysburg Address is just soaked in these themes of birth and death and rebirth. So I don't want to belabor this point, but let's look. So 7 years ago, we just know that's kind of biblical. But people listening at the time might know the actual reference. In Psalm 90, the days of our years are 70. And this is a psalm about how we've sinned. And that's why our lifespan is limited when it used to not be so limited prior, or not limited at all, prior to our sin. So it's not just that you get the biblical resonance, there's this meaning that we're at fault and something bad has happened because what we have done. Brought forth also. It's different than created or they started or they founded. Again, brought forth, biblical, and what do you bring forth, right? Bring forth, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in travail, a woman in labor, okay? Again, it's birth, very, very deep, and painful, right? Men don't know it. Our daughter Julia, when my wife was in labor, just the start of a long labor with her, we were in a nice hospital, and they always went to to take advantage if there's free food. So they came in rich. You want to order lunch? It's free. It's like, sure, I'll have a gyro and the French fries. And they bring it in, and just this wonderful, delicious aroma filled the room. My wife's, get that food out of here, you son of a gun. So we have that element. Conceive. We talked about conception, birth, death, all over this thing. And then. What's a proposition? So Lincoln would talk about, when he talked about the Declaration, the axioms of the Declaration, the axioms of liberty, but how's a proposition different than an axiom? What's that? Right, the axiom's proven, the proposition is not. So we're dedicated to this proposition, which means we believe in this, but we have to make it happen. So, I wrote a book on Lincoln, and I had to go back and look at this to even, recall all of this. And this is just the start, right? People have written books about the Gettysburg Address. So, in Lincoln, like Kyle Smith, like Red Smith, there's a myth that he wrote this on the back of an envelope on the train on the way to Gettysburg. Nonsense. This is the best of his thought, the best of his writing, and don't mess it up. Don't touch it. It is, it's exactly the way he meant it for a reason. So on a less exalted plane, this effort to rewrite literature, one of the big targets has been Roald Dahl, author of children's books. We all know him, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, fantastic, Mr. Fox, James and the Giant Peach, on and on and on. He's sold 300 million copies of his books. And just for context, that's a lot. As was mentioned in the introduction, I worked for Charles Krauthammer for a while, and we were friendly for years. And I actually saw a tweet, broke my heart, today. It's 5 years to the day of his passing, and it just so delighted him. He became a TV star, and his book, Things That Matter, sold. It was a huge success. It sold 1 million copies, and I like to, when I was at events with him, introducing him or moderating a discussion with him, I always like to say, and Charles and I, we're both authors, and we're such a best-selling authors. Collectively, our latest books have sold 1,010,000 copies, right? But 300 million, you don't mess with 300 million, or you wouldn't think so. My daughter, I'm not obsessed with my daughter, but she just discovered Roald Dahl. This is not a discussion, talk about my daughter, but she just discovered him, loves him. She'll carry around 3 of his books, even though she's just reading 1. So now there's some offensive material, especially if you are a small orange person with white eyebrows and green hair. Granted. But the kids like literature that has a little edge to it, that has nasty characters in it, has some words that are kind of edgy. But that's what we're trying to remove. So Dahl's publisher says now that sensitivity readers will regularly review the language to ensure that it can continue to be enjoyed by all today. So what does this sound? At least a little bit like Winston Smith in the Orwell novel. 1984, his job was to make sure every record has been destroyed or falsified, every book rewritten, every picture has been repainted, every statue and street building has been renamed, every date has been altered, so that nothing exists except an endless presence in which the party is always right. And it's worth remembering, he's not working for the good guys, right? So there would have been an assumption until recently that just going back and rewriting things is a bad idea. Now it's happened before. Thomas Boulder rewrote Shakespeare. He was not a bad guy. He meant well. He wanted to make it more family friendly. He'd remove about 10% of the plays. He changed stuff around. In Hamlet, Ophelia dies just accidentally in the water rather than drowning herself, a bad fishing accident or whatever it was. He realized he couldn't fix Othello. He just left that alone. But no one in the last 100 years has thought, oh, Thomas Boulder had the right idea, especially progressives didn't think he had the right idea. But what's happened is they've now become the prudes, except, ironically, about sexual material. So if there's something that they don't like about Roald Dahl, they'll excise the word immediately. But if some talentless hack writes a semi-pornographic graphic novel, they want it in the elementary schools in Florida, which I submit to you makes no sense. But they're coming after everyone else. They're coming after Ian Fleming and James Bond. They're coming after Agatha Christie. They have even targeted the great P.J. Woodhouse. I don't know whether you guys are familiar with the Jeeves novels, a story of a butler who has the misfortune to be working for a totally feckless and incompetent man that has gained some authority for reasons that no one can understand. I don't know how that got in there. Sorry, I gotta talk to my assistant. I mean, it's getting so bad they might actually come after Marquis de Sade next. All right, that's the last one, I promise. So this is what Inclusive Minds says they do. They're passionate about inclusion, and they're the people editing Roald Dahl. Passionate about inclusion, diversity, equality, and accessibility in children's literature. They're using sensitivity readers and inclusion ambassadors to rid these stories of offensive material. And the woman who likely was the head of the project to edit Roald Dahl describes herself as, quote, non-binary, asexual, polymorphous relationship anarchist who is on the autism spectrum. So totally normal, like exactly the person you want to have the gatekeeper to our children's literature. And what's happening here is Roald Dahl was really good at writing, right? These people are good at DEI. They are not good at writing. If they were good at writing, they would go and write best-selling novels, because that's a more gratifying and lucrative job than this. But here they are editing Roald Dahl. I'll just give you examples quickly from the novel The Witches. There's a grandmother's talking to, I assume, a naughty kid here. Don't be foolish. You can't go around pulling the hair of every lady you meet, even if she's wearing gloves. Just try it and see what happens. And they make it, don't be foolish. There are plenty of other reasons why women might wear wigs, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. It's a non sequitur. They've inserted a non sequitur in the story for no reason. There's nothing offensive about the first version. In the Twits, Mrs. Twit, quote, has a wonky nose, a crooked mouth, a double chin, and stick-out teeth. Now, thanks to our DEI friends, she has a wonky nose, crooked mouth, and stick-out teeth. She no longer has a double chin, right? Had she been working out with her Peloton at night? Is she like 15 years younger? You know, we don't know, right? They just take that out for no reason. He made a character a certain way, and these hacks say no, it has to be another way for no good reason. So what they've done, people who've looked at this closely, they've taken out all language related to weight, mental health, violence, gender, and race, and just color itself, actually, references have been taken out. So if we were going to do this, just an example to a passage in Moby Dick, what the white, no, we'd have to take that out. Pale whale was to Ahab, has been hinted at, et cetera, et cetera. Obvious considerations touching Moby, no, can't do that. Moby, the marine mammal, which cannot but occasionally awaken any man's, woman's, or person's of any gender's soul, no feelings, on and on, right? What if we did this, you know, to the Iliad? There's this, you know, heartbreaking, you know, Achilles is not in a great mood in the Iliad, so he's rejecting this embassy from the Achaean commanders. But anyway, cattle and fat sheep, no. Cattle and sheep can all be had for the raiding, tripeds for all the trading, and stallions and mares, not just stallions, and we just can't have them tawny-headed. They have to have all colors, but a person's, not man's breath, a life breath cannot come back again. No raiders enforce, no trading brings it back. Once it slips through a human being's clenched teeth, my birthing parent tells me, the immortal God is so on and so on. So if we actually did this, we would, to everything, we'd be taking all of the savor out of it, right? All that makes it special, that gives it that depth we were talking about with the Gettysburg Address, and changing the historical record, right? Roald Dahl did not write it that way. Melville didn't write it that way. Homer didn't write it that way. So it's as absurd and as grotesque in its way, an act of cultural vandalism, as if someone were going to say, you know what, Monet, the blue's not just quite right. You know, we got to make this more contemporary. Let's change it, right? There are guards who will tackle you and arrest you if you attempt to do that. Now, it's different, right? Because it's a physical artifact that can't be changed the way text can, back and forth. But the principle is the same. And it would be like, you know, saying Tchaikovsky wrote his 1812 overture in the wrong key. What authority do you have to do that? So this kind of the thinking that is targeting these writers is also targeting wider swaths of our culture. The classics are under assault. And this is just a strange phenomenon now, where you have people who've devoted their lives to studying a certain subject, turning on that subject and saying it's all about white supremacy and is a terrible thing that must end. So the New York Times recently had this a piece about this Princeton classicist, Daniel Padilla Perletta, and describing his point of view, which is quite influential now. He says, classics has been instrumental to the invention of whiteness and its continued domination, or as this scholar says, systemic racism is foundational to those institutions that incubate classics, and classics as a field itself. Now, Padilla, as it happens, very admirable, very moving story. He came to the US from the Dominican Republic. He lived in a homeless shelter as a kid for a while. He discovered what? The classics, started to read them, was taken by them, and the adventure of reading, gets a mentor who helps him, as very often happens, you know, in this country, goes on to get degrees just from Princeton, Oxford, and Stanford. So if there's anyone that you would think would appreciate the openness of the classics, it would be this scholar, but he doesn't. The Times said further in this piece, Enlightenment thinkers created a hierarchy with Greece and Rome coded as white on top and everything else below. This is, of course, total nonsense. The great philosophy of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, the plays, the oratory, the architecture, it's a kind of racism to say that only about white people or only white people can appreciate it. And the beauty of it is that it doesn't give you the answer or one take on anything, right? So you look at this famous fresco. It's amazing to think he spent 2 years painting this on a wall by Raphael in the Vatican, called the School of Athens. You have Plato and this little, whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. You have Plato and Aristotle here. Plato's pointing up because he's about ideals and forms and theories, and Aristotle's pointing down because he's more grounded and about practical categories, that's a debate, right? That's not, and it's not about whiteness. And the idea that only white people can appreciate that is completely insane. And there's a reason why we've put such an emphasis on the classics. It's because they gave us, Athens gave us the idea of democracy. It was an imperfect democracy. No one would want to live there, but it created the ideal of democracy. Rome has a crucial imprint on our legal system and other institutions. Western writers, thinkers, painters have existed, have interacted and bounced off classical thought and philosophy and writing for centuries, right? You wouldn't understand this painting unless you knew a little something about Plato and Aristotle. So to understand what our culture is, you need to get that. And yes, the Greeks and the Spartans and the Romans, horrible people, flawed in all sorts of ways. They had slavery, they were brutish, they had, it's terrifying reading about some of these military campaigns. And yet, they actually let people criticize their own society. And that didn't exist anywhere else in the ancient world. There's a reason there's no Mongol version of Aristophanes who was mocking his own society. They would have been killed immediately. And you could be killed, in Greece or Rome for this as well, right? We have the famous story of Socrates, but that ability to critique yourself is crucial to Western civilization. And this is where it comes from. And that's a really important thing to know. We have a similar effort going on. This is Alfred the Great, King of Britain, pretty important guy, only monarch in England known as the Great. He was an Anglo-Saxon king. But there's an effort now to say, we can't teach about the Anglo-Saxons. Cambridge University is saying the whole Anglo-Saxon thing is a constructed and contingent identity. The former International Society of Anglo-Saxonists was worried that the name of their organization associated them too much with Anglo-Saxons, has changed it to their name to the International Society for the Study of Early Medieval England. So it's true, there's a lot of romanticism about Anglo-Saxons, that history has been exploited by racists, but the notion of Anglo-Saxons just wasn't made up by the KKK or something. This is real history. Rome falls, the first place they exit from, the very periphery of the empire is Britain. They say you're on your own. Then the Angles and the Jutes and the Saxons start coming in. It's a mystery. Are they just migrating? Are they actually invading? Are they being invited in to fight other Anglo-Saxons and Jews? We don't know, but we know they came and they were real. And the term Anglo-Saxon, again, it's not something made up by 20th century American racists. It was a term in use in the 8th century. Alfred the Great called himself the king of the Anglo-Saxons. And the legacy is quite important. The name England comes from land of the Angles. The English language comes from Old English or Anglo-Saxon, the single most important language in the world. The Anglo-Saxons unify England as we know it. They give us English Christianity, which is very important because they convert. So to say we should know about this, because someone might be offended, is an act of cultural self-sabotage. And then we have it going on, as mentioned earlier, with Shakespeare. There's a book that came out recently, was treated favorably, and a lot of center-left publications, including The Atlantic, called White People and Shakespeare. The book alleges that Shakespeare was engaged in white people making. If anyone knows what that is, raise your hand in the Q&A section and let me know. They say it's unsurprising the fact that Shakespeare's global representational power exists almost in tandem with a global white cultural supremacy. So this is also reductive, based on this idea of this toxic idea the center left has come up with of whiteness, where Shakespeare, incredibly fecund mind and writer. We have words, dozens and dozens of them that come from Shakespeare. We don't even realize it. Accommodation, obscene, we get it from Shakespeare. Phrases, it's Greek to me, budge an inch, more sinned against than sinning, on and on and on. But the racialist critics of Shakespeare will say, well, he used the word fair a lot. The word fair, which means white, is used 900 times. It is used 900 times, but it's not used in a racial way, right? You get in Macbeth, he says, "So foul and fair a day I have not seen." In Trellis and Cressida, Aeneas gets fair leave to bring a fair message to the Greeks. On and on and on. So these folks, they just want to reduce all complexity and subtlety. And Shakespeare actually, in some of his sonnets, pushed back against what at the time was a traditional notion of beauty, being someone with blonde hair, a thin neck. He writes a number of sonnets about the so-called dark lady, who does not have any of those attributes and has a relatively dark complexion, and that he loves and is taken with anyway. So all this is concerning and would be a threat at any time. I think it's particularly risky, given that there is this internal threat to our culture and civilization is growing as we face an external threat. I just want to make a few points about that quickly, and then I'll conclude. So, there's a lot of focus on Ukraine and what could be a conflict with China over Taiwan, and people like Joe Biden talk about this as a democracy versus autocracy, which is an element of it. But I think it's a deeper cultural and civilizational struggle. Russia and China are countries that have never been part of the West. Russia occasionally has one foot in the West. Parts of its culture are part of the West. I mentioned Tchaikovsky, that would be an example. But all attempts to become the West have failed. And these are countries that resent us. They resent our success. They resent we have so much power, and they're hostile to us, and they want to take us down a notch. And they have never, throughout their entirety of their history, created a government and society that honors individual dignity and can create a functioning democracy. They've never done it. And it's important for us, I think, at this moment to realize, though, we can be used to Western supremacy, because it's been true the last 200, 300 years. But it hasn't always been true. If you look at the West at its very beginning, millennia ago, it was ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. We don't think of them as Western places now, but the Mediterranean was the locus of the West at that time, and these were different societies. Again, we wouldn't think of them as Western. They had no Bill of Rights. You couldn't get a decent cappuccino, but they were the West compared to the East, and they were ahead for thousands of years, literally thousands and thousands of years ahead of the West. And then they had this catastrophic fall. There was a disease, catastrophic patterns of migration, state failure, kind of a version of the Biden administration, and they fell. And the East picked up and got closer, and then you had Rome that put a Western socioeconomic development on a totally different trajectory. Rome, at least in the West, falls around 500. And then there's some argument that the West does not reach that same level of development until like the 18th century. I mean, it is a very long time. And it can be humbling to realize during that period, the East and China, they were ahead of us. China had bigger ships. They were doing longer navigation. They had better mechanical implements. They had better watches. They had more productive agriculture. They had a capital city that put London to shame, Beijing. London was just a backwater. And then in the blink of an eye, what happens is China closes itself off, no longer going to do navigation. They're going to burn their fleet. They turn inward, and the West has this incredible takeoff, partly based on the competition between all these squabbling states in Europe, which puts an emphasis on innovation. You have to innovate to survive. So you see innovation in technology, in military tactics, in finance, and before you know it, the West can send literally like a gunship or two and bring China to its knees. And China feels humiliated by us because they were indeed humiliated. And this, we don't have to focus on this a lot, but this is just the blue or turquoise or whatever that is. That's the West, and the red is the East. And you see, barely Egypt and Mesopotamia ahead. You see a spike here. I think that's Rome right there. The fall. You see East taking over, and then boom. This is what created the modern world. This is the Industrial Revolution. This is the Renaissance. This is the industrial takeoff in the Netherlands and England that's then extended here in the United States. And one thing we should always be grateful for and realize that this is a very detailed take on it. If you take a slightly different perspective and smooth out some of the rough spots, this is what you get.
So basically all of humanity, recorded history, socioeconomic development is nothing. It's just nothing. It's flat. Even the Roman upswing, in the scheme of things, it's a minor uptick until you get this. So again, this is why we're here. This is why we're in a beautiful space. This is why we have decent dental care. This is why we live longer. This is why we're more comfortable, more happier probably on the whole, although we have some problems. So that's a big deal. And what we have to watch for is the last big shift in world power, handover and international leadership. It was from the English to us, after World War II. And it was totally seamless in the scheme of things. Why? Because we share the same language, we share the same culture, we share by and large the same values, we share much of the same history. We're kind of, I wouldn't exaggerate, the same people. So that doesn't mean there's still not acts of hostility undertaken by the United States against the British Crown. We sent them Meghan Markle. In their wisdom, they sent her right back. But if this is the shift with China, that's not the way it's going to happen, right? Not the same language, not the same culture, not the same values, not the same history. In fact, a lot of the history leads them to hate and resent us. And if you think it's bad now, the way like American financiers who owe everything to this country kowtow to China, or the way NBA players kowtow to China, just wait until China has the whip hand in geopolitics. They will not leave us alone. Every rule of the road will be written in their favor, and the goal will be to humiliate us the way they feel we humiliated them. So I started with Lincoln. I just want to circle back to Lincoln, because I mean, this is always a very apt quote. Some of you might know it from the Lyceum Address. When he was a young lawyer, no one knew him in 1838. He gave this wonderful speech, and he talked about how even then, here in North America, we're pretty invulnerable. He said you could take Napoleon, the greatest general in world history, put him in charge of the greatest army in world history, and that army could not take a drink from the Ohio River or take a step on the Blue Ridge mountains by force of arms. Then he went on to say, if destruction be our lot, we ourselves must be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. And I submit to all of you tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we must resolve to live. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Rich Lowry. Thank you, Rich, so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
So you're going to end on the word suicide. Okay. So we have some time for questions. Do we have questions for Rich? We don't have any questions for Rich Lowry. Jeff, right here.
Hold on. Oh, are we? Thank you, Rich. This is wonderful talk. Are we dying by suicide?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long suicide. And if you just look at the material advantages of this country, our geographic location, right? The gravest threat we face in the north is like an annoying, pretty boy, Canadian prime minister. The greatest threat to the south is a Mexican government that just can't control enough of its territory. Compared to being on the steppes of Eurasia, this is as good as it gets. Access to two oceans, still an incredibly dynamic economic system. I think a lot about, I'm old enough now, I can remember when NASA was cool, right? I was a kid, it was after the glory days of Apollo, but still it was cool, and my friends, we'd tape these glossy pictures of NASA rockets on our walls and NASA astronauts. That's an unusual thing for a government agency to be cool. And then very quickly, it sort of slid into bureaucratic mediocrity, and the space shuttle, I think, was a giant white elephant. And how has the space program been revived, right? You have this trolling, kind of half out of his mind, American entrepreneur who went to NASA and said, you know what, your procurement system sucks, and I can do it better. And NASA, to his credit, said, okay, Elon, try, try, show us. And he has. So if we beat the Chinese in the space race, which we need to do, that'll be a reason why. So that's the amazing force for vitality. And I don't think we'd lose a war to anyone. I wouldn't necessarily want to try it. But the downside is we've had this rise of kind of loneliness in this country, people disconnected from work, from family, from church, especially men. That's very bad for anyone, especially bad for men. So you get these deaths of despair and heroin and fentanyl, just heartbreaking. You have this terrible experiment we've undertaken on our young people in the form of devices and social media the last decade that I think we can now say has been a catastrophe, that we need to figure a way to roll that back. And we just have this tendency I've talked about. We need to believe in ourselves, right? A nation needs a myth, not in the sense like you just totally made it up, but something that makes you feel greater and bigger. I talk about this with the painting Washington crossing the Delaware. There's a lot of falsehoods in it, right? There's no American flag that existed at the time. James Monroe was holding the flag. He future president. No, he was on shore. He wasn't there. Ice, when the river's iced over, it doesn't have these beautiful ice cubes in it that you'd like in your drink, back there. No, it's just flat or jagged. So all that's wrong, and debunkers have had a field day with it. But then you look at the truth. It's a small action. You don't see many boats, and it was a small action, right? Washington had been decimated coming out of New York, and you look at the faces of those folks in the boats. They're afraid, right? Because they know this is the whole ball game, one, and Washington was very cautious generally, but he's rolling the dice, and these guys couldn't swim, which also makes you a little bit afraid. Perhaps another truth is that they're all wearing different styles of dress, representing they came from all over the country. This was the main nationalizing institution, the Army. There's even one figure in the boat that people think is a woman, which I think the women with us tonight would probably buy, because she's the only one actually oaring, working while the guys are standing there around. And then you're like, oh, they couldn't stand in a boat, because they might have. They were flat-bottomed boats. So you take all that, and you go to the Met in New York and look at it, awe-inspiring. It just brings home to you sacrifice, the commitment, the glory of it. That's what a country needs, and that's what we're losing.
Kristen?
Rich, thank you. I think everybody in this room probably understands what the problem is that you've so thoughtfully pointed out in the last half hour. How do we fix it?
All right, you had to ask the hard question. Telling the truth. That's the crucial ingredient, is telling the truth and not being afraid to tell the truth, because so much of this, and there are other elements of it that beyond the scope of this talk, is based on kind of manufacturing consent through convincing you, or at least making you just accept or go along with the idea that if you don't buy it, you're a racist, you're a homophobe, you're a hater, you want vulnerable people to suffer, and you need to shut up. That's a key part of it, and we just can't. And then you just gotta grind it out. And on the basic stuff, on probably most of what I said tonight, if you put it in different terms, you probably get 60 or 70% assent. So I'm a believer still in the deep common sense and patriotism of the American public. But what they're doing is trying to erode that slowly but surely. And we got to protect it, use it, and push back as hard as we can. And the schools are obviously crucially important. I don't have a great answer for you, but at least these are some thoughts. So these school board fights, localities around the country, crucial. We have a system that's decentralized, which means, crucially, you just can't have one person, the Secretary of Education, just deciding, this is what we're going to teach. Because right now it'd be a debacle, it'd be a catastrophe. Instead, you can, as an average citizen, spend $300 and commit to knocking on a lot of doors and doing meetings and get elected to the school board, and seriously, no kidding, have more influence on your education system than the Secretary of Education. That's one of the glories of our system. We've done a lot of that. We need to do more. And then the colleges and the universities, there should be no woke public colleges or university in any red state. There just should not. And this is, I give great credit to Ron DeSantis Finally, he figured it out. These are public institutions. They're government institutions. You got a state government. Someone is writing the rules for what they do. And we're not just going to let them do it. We're going to do it ourselves. So he's said we're going to have they're going to have a Western Civ requirement in Florida, et cetera. We're going to rip out all the DEI. You need to do that in every state that has a Republican governor. Maybe you need a Republican legislature as well, but everyone needs to follow that example. But look, it's going to be a hard fight. It's on all fronts. And we can't despair, but we also can't have a rosy-eyed view of it, like this problem is going to take care of itself. It's not.
Kristen?
Yes, thank you very much for being here tonight. It's actually wonderful to hear your view on everything. I do have a question. You mentioned Florida. What about rewriting textbooks? What about rewriting certain parts of our history that have been so important to our history? For example, Rosa Parks, or what is being done to the textbooks in Florida. I mean, isn't there a point of view of both sides are editing history as we know it?
Yeah, so I don't think that that's happening in Florida. The contention in Florida is over these books that are in libraries. And you can argue whether the process is the right one, but what happens, a parent can say, I don't like this book, or this book shouldn't be in my kid's library. And then there's a committee that reviews it. And and it's all done by localities, by the school districts and the counties. And some stuff it seems like they've gotten wrong. Some things you hear in the press, they get blown up, isn't this terrible? Like a Jackie Robinson biography was reviewed, which is absurd. But the book was, at the end of the day, it was left. It was preserved. There's one the other day, a county is supposedly censoring or banning a couple books, and it was based on, they reviewed 4 of them, and left one of them in the elementary side of the school library and moved 3 to the middle school side of the library. So these are just it's not Fahrenheit 451. And Florida, actually, the curriculum standards say you need to teach about slavery, you need to teach about civil rights. It says it in great specificity. So I don't think anyone that I'm aware of on the conservative side is saying, let's not teach that stuff. My point would be, let's teach the truth. So there's ugly stuff in there. There are heroes who are African Americans. Obviously, they're some of the foremost freedom fighters in our history. Let's honor them and tell the truth about them. But let's not take the further step to not telling the story of other American heroes and/or changing the whole narrative arc of America to say it's all been woe and repression and racism, just because I think that's a lie.
Rebecca? John?
So I asked this only from the perspective of language and writing. But I note that at the beginning of your talk, you did not tell us what your pronouns were.
Is that a question?
There's some words that have just been ruined. Pronouns is one. I never thought pronouns would be a word that make me bristle every time I heard it. I do think that the tide on pronouns may be receding. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but this is what's concerning. You're my side of the aisle. Someone like a women's studies professor or someone like 30 years ago wrote an insane paper that was read by 5 people about how everyone needs different pronouns and all these different genders. And National Review, if we took any notice of it, we just would have mocked it. This is crazy. It's never going to happen. And then it seems like 5 years ago, a committee meets in a room somewhere and it's decided every elite institution in America tomorrow will have preferred pronouns, and it happens. So that's just really, really disturbing. But I think the Dylan Mulvaney thing, especially the Bud Light trans person, I think that's kind of highlighted the absurdity. He's a gay man. I mean, he's clearly a gay man. He always was a gay man. He still is a gay man. And the idea that one day he can say, I'm a man, and the next day you got to call me a woman with these pronouns, it highlights the absurdity of it. So I think we're seeing some healthy pushback on that, but he, him, his.
Thank you, Rich. One more question back here.
I want to find out what you thought could be done right now. We have some 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds living at home temporarily.
So-
we've
so
been
you
watching
think.
the news. And I will give you some background. That background is I went to interview a man to write an article about his life. I stopped asking him when he told me that when he retired as a colonel in the Army, he went to work for some sisters. And I asked a few more questions, including who owned the company. And when I found out it was Ollie North, I stopped asking. I did then ask him, let me ask you this. I just spent July 5th, 2016, watching our FBI director talk about all the different laws that were broken by our Secretary of State. At the end of that telebriefing to everybody, the decision was made, okay, don't do anything about this. So I asked him, when this goes on, what can you do to get people to really think about the truth? And he said to me, well, now he tells me, working in the CIA, the very best weapon that we had was not waterboarding or any type of torture that people talk about in movies. The best weapon is telling a lie over and over and over again. And he said, even the people telling the lie begin to believe it.
Do we have a question?
Now I bring you back to here and now, where 20 and 30-year-olds are watching TV, watching the news, and they say that's a lie because the news that they're watching never has a different point of view. But they're hearing the lie over and over and over again. How do you have conversation now with people that never hear any different information, and you're trying to say, yes, but here's what's really happening, or here's the facts? They don't hear the facts. And how can you really have a country be informed if there's only one source of information and they're not willing to listen to anything?
I'm going to try an answer on this one. Go ahead, Rich. You have to read National Review. You have to read Rich Lowry and all the great writers for National Review. Rich, I want to thank you for being with us.
Wonderful. Thanks,
We hope
everyone.
you'll come back.
Of course.
And ladies and gentlemen, please thank Mr. Rich Lowry. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again for being with us. We look forward to seeing you at Liberty Hill, at Torresdale, and at UL National for our next lectures. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you again.